Okay, good afternoon, or possibly still good morning for some of you. For today's webinar, we are going to go ahead and talk about banking and what that looks like inside of QuickBooks. All right, so now for the topic at hand, we're going to go through banking. So first, we just kind of want to talk high level about what the standard banking transactions and entry looks like inside of QuickBooks. First off, when we're talking about setting up any kind of banking accounts in QuickBooks, there is just one type of account that you can set up, which is a bank account. Sometimes other systems might call those cash accounts. Bank accounts can also be a variety of accounts, so it's not limited to just your standard checking or operating account. You'll also see bank accounts set up for savings accounts, any kind of petty cash. In addition to that, sometimes if we've got clearing accounts for an outside system that's flowing through QuickBooks and we need some sort of wash account set up, for example, we see that often with payroll if we're using an outside system, or if we have any kind of web store or commercial platform that's connecting to the QuickBooks file. We'll see bank accounts set up as clearing accounts that act as a pass-through account for the data that's being integrated. When we talk about the types of transactions related to our banking functions, the four main types that you'll see are checks, deposits, general journal entries, and sales receipts. So now that we've identified what those transaction types are, we can go ahead and look at how that entry happens inside of a QuickBooks file. So inside of my sample file here, if we start with that first option of check, I'm going to come up here to my banking tab and choose write check. This is going to take me to my write check screen. So you can see here that this looks very similar to when you're entering a vendor bill inside of QuickBooks. Now, some examples of when we might use a check as opposed to a vendor bill are if we're entering any kind of internal or overhead expenses to the company. We like to call those indirect expenses. And what that means is they don't relate to the services or goods that we're selling to our clients. So this is an example of when we could write a check rather than entering a vendor bill. In addition to that, if you don't have terms with the vendor or contractor that you're writing a check to for expenses that you are paying for, a check is another option, again, rather than entering that vendor bill, will allow you to see the payables and the aging of that open balance. One of the things you'll notice here on my check entry screen is that we've got two tabs available to enter that expense. We've got one option here that says expenses. That's the tab I'm currently sitting on. Our other option is items. When you're writing a check, similar to entering a vendor bill, you've got two options for inputting that expense. You can put it directly to an item on your items list, so some sort of billing code or product from your list that you want to put that expense directly to. Or I can use my expenses tab and post directly to a GL account. In most cases, since we stated that checks are often written for internal or overhead expenses, we would anticipate using this expenses tab and posting directly to a GL account. In this example here, if we were paying for marketing, for example, I can write a check to the company we are using and post it directly to my advertising expense account. One of the other things that you can also do for checks is you have this option up here that says print later. If you decide that you are going to be printing checks directly from QuickBooks rather than using some sort of outside or personal checking book, you can note to print later, and this will ensure that it gets added to the queue for you to go in and print. A lot of times we have clients who will make this check mark and then they'll do a check run at the end of the week to print all checks to send out. The next transaction type we want to look at, that's the other primary transaction that makes up our banking function, is deposit. So again, everything is going to function under this banking tab. So we had banking write checks, and now we've got banking make deposits. You'll notice here this window pops up when I choose it that says payments to deposit. In QuickBooks, you have the option to use an account called undeposited funds. And what that means is if you receive payment from your customers, but you are not making that deposit to your bank account until you've got a lump sum of payments you're going to add at once, the undeposited funds account will act as a holding account. So essentially, when you receive payment from your customers, that payment will go to undeposited funds. And then when you make a true lump sum deposit with your bank, you can choose to make that same deposit in QuickBooks so that the deposit is the same between the two. If I didn't have any payments that were currently in my undeposited funds account, this window would not appear, and I'd instead be able to come in here and choose who I've received money from and the opposing account that the deposit should go to. Again, when we're writing checks and making deposits, one side of those transactions is always going to hit the bank account, and the other side is going to typically hit an income or an expense account or possibly undeposited funds. The next transaction type that we see inside of our bank accounts is a general journal entry. These are usually input if we're making any kind of adjustment to our bank account. Sometimes if we've got maybe a transaction that was entered late, or if there was a service fee, for example, or some sort of processing fee that wasn't accounted for, interest earned by the bank, things of that nature. We see those entered via a journal entry. Again, it's not common for us to see that, but if so, we would come in here to our company tab and choose make general journal entry, and we'd be able to input information. Okay, now that we've talked through how that data gets into the QuickBooks file, the next thing we want to talk about is actually performing banking related actions inside of the system once our checks, our deposits are in our QuickBooks file. One of the ways you can actually work to have some of this automated is through a function called bank feeds inside of QuickBooks. What the bank feeds allow you to do is create a direct connection between your bank account and QuickBooks. This feature isn't actually just limited to bank account transactions. You can also do it with credit cards or sometimes even loans, depending on the institution that your loan is through. Not all bank or credit card institutions do have a direct connection, so that is something to keep in mind. However, a lot of the banking institutions will at least have some sort of export function that you can use with QuickBooks to get that information in a more efficient manner. One of the things that you can do as well with the bank feeds is you can help create what are called rules to ensure that if we have any kind of reoccurring transactions that we expect to see when we download that data, QuickBooks will work to remember that and know where to post the information. If I come back to our sample file, and again, a lot of our functionality is going to come from this banking tab, I can come in here to banking and down to bank feeds, and I can say set up bank feed for an account. What will happen at this point is you'll choose the name of your bank account and you will input your bank account credentials, so your username and your login. And once you've logged in, you're able to tell QuickBooks what account from your banking institution you'd like to connect to inside of the QuickBooks file. Now, one thing to note with the bank feeds is that you will have to perform the download of the latest banking activity. So once you've got that bank account connected, you'll be able to come in here routinely to your bank feed center and download the most recent transactions that have happened since the last download. You'll then be able to tell QuickBooks where the transactions should be added to in order to get them into the bank register. So again, the bank feeds is a great option to help reduce some of that manual entry that we're doing right now with entering checks and deposits. The other thing that we're able to do once the checks and deposits are in the system, again, be it via our bank feeds option, or if we're entering those manually, that's going to be reconciling the account. We're going to use the bank statement that we get from our bank institution, and we're going to ensure that all transactions are entered for that statement period and ensure that we're getting to the same statement ending balance that's on our banking document. In order to go through a banking reconciliation, I would come in here to banking and reconcile. QuickBooks will default to the main operating account, but you'll notice here I can choose from my drop-down menu and I can pick any account to reconcile. So here I'm going to go ahead and choose my company checking account, which is my main operating account. I would then come in here and put the statement end date. That's what's going to show on my statement that I was emailed or physically sent. The beginning balance that shows is based off of the last reconciliation that was done. So in this case, this account hasn't been reconciled yet, but once you perform your reconciliation, that will always act as the beginning balance when you go to do the next month. This ending balance here is based off of the statement end date, so that's going to be the new balance that we're reconciling to. And then below here, we've got some options if there's any kind of service charges or, processing fees, bank fees that apply, as well as interest earned. We also have the capability to input that here rather than doing an alternative entry like a journal entry we had discussed previously. Once I have all of this information into the system, I would go ahead and say continue. And then QuickBooks is going to bring me to my reconciliation screen. One side here on the left has all of my checks and payments. So this is the money coming out of my bank account. The other side has any deposits or credits. So that's money coming into the account. There's also a nice little feature here in the upper right-hand corner that says hide transactions after the statement's end date. So what that allows me to do is this period that I'm reconciling is November 30th. So that means I don't want anything past that date to show. So if I go ahead and click this, it would hide anything not dated before. So that makes sure that we're not accidentally reconciling something in the incorrect period. Once I know I've got all of my transactions for the right range, then I can come in here and check off the transactions that are showing on my statement. The end goal, once I've come in here and checked all of these off, is that my ending balance is the balance we are getting to, and this difference is 0. So what that means is if my difference is 0, my checks and my deposits that I have included in the reconciliation do not get us to the final balance we are trying to reconcile to. So that's always a good way to check to make sure we either didn't miss something from our statement or didn't accidentally add something to be reconciled in this period when it's not. So looking to this difference is a great way to know if we're able to reconcile correctly for that period. One of the other things that's really nice about the reconciliation screen is you have this option that says leave. And what happens is if you say leave, it will go ahead and maintain what you've done so far. And when you come back into the reconciliation area, it will pick up from where you left off I love that functionality, especially if we've got some accounts that have a large amount of activity. It's a great way to be able to take a break and come back and not lose those efforts that you've put in to reconcile thus far. So that's a great thing to note, is that you do have the option to leave and come back into the screen, and you have all of the activities saved. One of the other things to note as far as the reconciliation is concerned is you do have these mark all and unmark all. If you're really diligent about making sure you're reconciling your QuickBooks account, these mark all and unmark all functions might be available to you. Sometimes I have clients where if their activity month over month is minimal, they're able to choose mark all because everything that they're entering in that period is clearing. So if I go ahead and say mark all, QuickBooks is going to check off all of the transactions in this period that's showing, and then I will be able to see if my difference at the end is 0. If it's not, again, that tells me I've either maybe marked on something I shouldn't have, or I could possibly be missing a transaction. One thing to note is even if this difference isn't 0, you do technically have the option to say reconcile now. Again, we don't recommend that pending what that difference is. If this difference came out to maybe just 70 cents rather than $27,000 and some change, of course, that value is so minimal, probably not worth looking through to find it. So you can always push through an adjustment at that point. If I were to choose reconcile now, QuickBooks is going to give me this notice that says, you still have this discrepancy. Would you like to return to the reconciliation? Go ahead and leave it or enter the adjustment. So again, that is something that you can force through, but our recommendation is that we should be trying to identify what that variance is, pending the value of it. Okay, so those are the tips as far as going through and setting up our bank feeds to help with the banking entries. And then once those entries are in the system, how we would go through and reconcile an account. Now, the last thing that we have to talk through is going to be our different reporting options when it comes to banking. So there are a few things when we're talking about banking where we can look to see the information that's input into QuickBooks. We've got some check and deposit detail reports, a missing checks report, reconciliation discrepancy, which relates to what we were just talking through if we force a reconciliation through, and then previous reconciliations. So if I come in here to our sample QuickBooks file, I'm now going to go to the tab next to banking and come to reports. And then down below, we've got this banking section. So those first two, we've got deposit detail and check detail. They sound exactly like what they are. If I run this report and update the date, I can run it for last month, for example. This is going to show me the deposits that were input based off of my date range. And then it tells me the payments or line items on those deposits. You can see my first deposit here from November 2nd shows 3 payments from customers that were included in that particular deposit. Same idea if I come in here to our reports and to banking and I want to look at our check detail. Again, it's going to show me all checks that have been input based off of the date range, and then the other expense account that those checks are hitting. So in this example, we've mainly got some liability checks that were being paid out for payroll, but any kind of expenses, bill payments to our vendors, those would all show here in our check detail. The next one here under our banking section is missing checks. What this one allows you to do is it points out if there are checks that the bank account expects to see, and or if there are any duplicate transaction numbers within the account. So if I had 2 checks in here, for example, with the reference number 1234, this would show up on this report. Sometimes also when deleting a transaction, it can be kept in the background of the QuickBooks software, but the account itself won't show it, and our account balance will be wrong. So this missing check report helps to ensure that the transactions we expect to see on the credit side are in the actual account. All right, then this next one here, so second of the last two reports for banking, we've got reconciliation discrepancy, and again, this sounds just like what it is. So we looked at that example of forcing a reconciliation through, where QuickBooks would make an adjustment to allow that reconciliation to complete. If we performed that function, it would show up on this report in the form of an adjustment, and we would see what that adjustment balance is. So this is a great report to be mindful of. Again, some of those smaller balances, we understand making an adjustment for. It's not worth the time to search for it, but we want to ensure this isn't a growing report and that those balances aren't significant. If so, we would probably want to go back and try to identify where those missing transactions are, or if we've got transactions with the wrong account balance. Otherwise, hopefully this is a report that we would see empty as we do right now. So that means we're not pushing any reconciliations through, we're not forcing QuickBooks to make an adjustment, and we're checking off the correct transactions when we're doing that reconciling. All right, now the very last report that we have under banking is going to be previous reconciliation. So as you can see here, similar to that reconciliation screen where you can choose the account you want to reconcile, we have the option here to look at previous reconciliations that have been done for an account. So if I choose from this drop-down menu, I can choose an account I want to look at, and if we had reconciled the account at all of those statement end dates would show here, and I would be able to look at those reports to see what was reconciled in that period. So similar to your bank account statement that we use for reference when reconciling the account, that's kind of what these previous reconciliation reports would look like. It would show our starting account balance, the checks and deposits that we reconciled in that period, an ending balance, and then any new or outstanding transactions that remain uncleared as of that date and time. So again, this is also a great one to look at if our account balance is incorrect. When we go to do our next reconciliation, these reports will show if something was possibly reconciled incorrectly in a certain period. Okay, so now we've talked through Banking 101, so what those transaction types look like when we're talking about banking activity inside of QuickBooks, how we can set up bank feeds, as well as how to reconcile a bank account whenever we've got that data entered into the QuickBooks file, and then those stock reports available on the banking side, where we can check our transaction detail for the checks or the deposits that are in the system, look at any kind of missing transactions, review any kind of reconciliation discrepancies, and then finally compare our previous reconciliations to make sure that that data stays the same. So all of those things combined will help to make sure that we're performing our banking activities as efficiently as possible inside of QuickBooks. We really appreciate the time today. Thank you guys so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday.